I will leave immediately. Where is my ticket flight? Bye-bye, Didi.
No, that's not funny.
Okay.
That's not funny. I'm done with the whole thing, and he's going home.
Mido is?
Figure out what you got to do. Get an Uber. You need a ticket home.
The marriage certificate was supposed to be the proof that Mido and Debby had finally chosen each other. Instead, it may be the one document that makes everything look worse. Because the moment that date appears, the entire relationship suddenly has a second timeline. On one timeline, Mido is frustrated, uncomfortable, questioning his future, and clearly obsessed with a life much bigger than the one Debby is offering him. On the other, he has already made one of the biggest legal commitments possible. And that creates a question Debby cannot ignore anymore. If Mido was so uncertain about the relationship, why was he apparently so certain about getting married? That is where this gets uncomfortable. Because the marriage itself is not the strange part. The timing is. If two people are deeply in love, secretly getting married can sound romantic. Maybe they wanted privacy. Maybe they did not want outside pressure. Maybe they simply wanted one moment that belonged to them instead of the cameras. But when that secret commitment sits next to constant arguments, emotional distance, and Mido's growing fixation on what America could do for his future, the same piece of paper starts looking very different. Suddenly, Debby is not asking whether Mido loved her on their wedding day. She is asking what exactly he believed that wedding day would unlock. And once that question enters her mind, there is no easy way to remove it. Because Debby starts looking backward. Not at the biggest fights, at the smallest details. The conversations where she talked about building a peaceful life together, and Mido immediately redirected everything toward opportunity. The moments when she wanted reassurance, and he seemed more excited discussing where they might live. The times she spoke about marriage like it was the beginning of their life together. While Mido seemed to speak about America like it was the beginning of his life. Those two things sound similar until you listen closely. Then they sound completely different. Debby thought they were planning a future. Mido may have been planning access to one. And Hollywood becomes impossible to ignore. Because Mido does not seem to dream small. He does not talk like someone who simply wants stability, a job, and a quiet start in a new country. His imagination is much louder than that. He sees possibility everywhere. Acting, recognition, better connections, bigger cities, more important rooms, a chance to become somebody people notice. There is nothing wrong with ambition. That is important. Wanting to become an actor does not make somebody dishonest. Wanting to move to Los Angeles does not prove bad intentions. Wanting more from life does not mean you cannot also love the person beside you. But ambition becomes a problem when the relationship starts feeling less like a partnership and more like infrastructure. And Debby begins to notice something she previously dismissed. Whenever she talks about what makes her comfortable, Mido talks about what limits him. Whenever she talks about settling down, he talks about moving forward. Whenever she imagines creating a home, he imagines escaping one. That difference may have existed from the beginning, but love gave Debby a softer explanation for it. She told herself Mido simply needed time. He was adjusting. He was under pressure. He had left behind everything familiar. Of course he would be restless. Of course he would think about what came next. Of course America represented possibility to him. But the certificate changes the emotional math. Because if Mido committed legally before resolving those doubts, then Debby has to ask whether resolving the doubts was ever necessary. Maybe the marriage itself solved the problem he cared about most. And that thought hits her harder than any argument. Because Debby can handle Mido being disappointed. She can handle him being impatient. She can even handle the possibility that America is not what he imagined. What she cannot handle is the idea that she may have confused his urgency with love. The more she studies the timeline, the more unusual it begins to feel. Before the marriage, there is tension. There are questions about where they will live, questions about lifestyle, questions about money, questions about Mido's ambitions, questions about whether the two of them even imagine the same kind of future. Normally those problems slow a wedding down. You stop, you talk. You figure out whether you are actually compatible before making the commitment harder to undo. But here the pressure seems to work in the opposite direction. The more unstable everything becomes, the more important the commitment suddenly appears. That is what Debby cannot make sense of. Why rush toward permanence while behaving increasingly unsure about the person you are becoming permanent with? Unless the permanence is the point. That possibility changes everything. Debby starts remembering the reassurance she received before the marriage. Mido could be warm when he needed to be. He could talk about possibility in a way that made Debby believe their problems were temporary. He could make frustration sound like passion. He could make ambition sound like something they would experience together. And Debby wanted to believe him, because believing him protected the entire story she had built in her head. This was not just a relationship to her. It was proof that life could still surprise her. Proof that she could still be chosen. Proof that adventure had not ended. So when Mido talked about a bigger future, Debby did not immediately hear danger. She heard excitement. Maybe they would travel. Maybe they would reinvent themselves. Maybe helping him chase a dream would make their relationship stronger. The problem is that Mido's version of the dream keeps getting more specific, while Debby's place inside it keeps getting less clear. Hollywood, acting, contact, auditions, Los Angeles, visibility, opportunity, those words keep growing. But where exactly is Debby in that picture? Is she standing beside him? Is she supporting him from somewhere else? Is she funding the beginning? Is she expected to move? Is she expected to wait? Or is she simply the person who makes the first chapter possible? That is the question she finally cannot avoid. And then something else starts bothering her. Mido seems much more comfortable talking about the sacrifices Debby should make than the sacrifices he is willing to make for her. If Hollywood requires money, there is an assumption that money can somehow be found. If Hollywood requires travel, there is an assumption that travel can somehow happen. If Hollywood requires moving, Debby is supposed to at least consider it. But when Debby asks whether Mido could simply build a normal life with her first, that idea suddenly sounds unbearable to him. And now the conflict becomes much deeper than career ambition. Because Debby is no longer asking whether Mido wants to act. She is asking whether there is any version of their marriage that he wants if acting does not happen. That distinction matters. Anyone can stay devoted while everything is going according to plan. The real test begins when the plan disappears. So Debby quietly changes the conditions. She does not announce anything dramatic. She does not scream. She does not threaten divorce. She simply begins asking practical questions. What exactly would moving closer to Hollywood cost? How would they pay for it? What work would Mido do while trying to become an actor? How much savings is he expecting them to use? How long is Debby supposed to support the transition? What happens if there are no auditions? What happens if the first year produces nothing? What happens if Los Angeles does not open its doors simply because Mido arrives believing he deserves to be there? These are ordinary questions, but Mido does not hear them as ordinary. He hears doubt, and that reaction gives Debby another reason to worry. Because somebody with a realistic dream should be able to discuss a realistic plan. Instead, every practical question seems to become an emotional attack. Mido tells her she does not believe in him. Debby says belief is not the same as unlimited money. Mido says she knew he had ambitions. Debby says ambition was never the problem. The problem is that she is beginning to feel responsible for making those ambitions happen. And that is when the entire relationship reaches a new level of tension. Because Mido has a fair point. Debby did know he wanted more. She did encourage him. She did make the future sound exciting. She may even have told him that America could create opportunities he could never access before. So from Mido's perspective, Debby is suddenly changing the agreement. The dream was romantic when it was theoretical. Now that he wants to actually pursue it, she is putting conditions on everything. He looks at Debby and asks what changed. She does not answer immediately. Because what changed is not Hollywood. What changed is trust. The certificate changed trust. Before Debby knew exactly when the marriage happened, she could separate Mido's ambition from their commitment. Now the two things appear connected. Maybe unfairly, maybe accidentally, but they are connected in her mind. And once she notices that connection, she begins revisiting every major moment. She remembers how urgently Mido sometimes spoke about the future. She remembers promises that sounded enormous, but strangely vague. She remembers how quickly he could become frustrated whenever reality did not resemble the version of America he had imagined. She remembers the moments when his disappointment was not really about Debby at all. It was about geography, lifestyle, money, opportunity, access, and suddenly Debby realizes something painful. Some of their worst arguments may not have been relationship arguments. They may have been arguments between Mido and the life he believed Debby was supposed to provide. That is much harder to fix. You can apologize for saying something cruel. You can compromise about where to live. You can learn each other's habits. But how do you compromise when one person sees the marriage itself as a gateway to a completely different life? Debby decides she needs an answer. Not another promise, not another speech about love, an answer. She waits until Mido starts talking about Hollywood again. He is excited, he has ideas, he talks about what could happen if they were closer to the industry. He talks about meeting the right people. He talks about needing better photographs, better exposure, more opportunities. Debby listens, then she asks him one question. If Hollywood disappeared tomorrow, would you still want this marriage? Mido stops, not because he necessarily has something to hide, but because it is a brutal question. There is almost no safe answer. If he says yes immediately, Debby will want to know why his behavior suggests otherwise. If he hesitates, the hesitation becomes the answer. If he gets angry, Debby will interpret the anger as avoidance. And Mido knows it. So instead of answering directly, he challenges the question. Why is she suddenly making him choose? Why does loving Debby require him to abandon everything he wants? Why is his dream being treated like evidence against him? And for a moment, Debby has no response. Because he is right about one thing. She is asking him to prove love by imagining failure. That is not completely fair. But Debby is not really asking him to give up Hollywood. She wants to know whether Hollywood is a dream inside their marriage or whether the marriage is simply one step inside his Hollywood dream. There is a massive difference. Mido tells her she is overthinking everything. Debby brings up the marriage date. The room changes. Because now they are no longer arguing about ambition. They are arguing about sequence. Debby asks why the marriage happened when it did. Why so quietly? Why during a period when they seemed less stable than ever? Why make the commitment before they had solved the biggest questions between them? Mido says people get married because they love each other. Debby asks why love suddenly required speed. Mido says there was no secret strategy. Debby asks why she now feels like the only person who did not understand how important the timing was. That line lands. Because Mido realizes Debby is no longer looking for reassurance. She is building a case in her own mind. And once somebody begins organizing memories into evidence, even innocent moments can start looking suspicious. Mido becomes defensive. Debby becomes more precise. She does not accuse him of never loving her. That would almost be easier. Instead, she asks whether he can honestly say that America, opportunity, and his career had nothing to do with his urgency. Mido cannot say that. Because of course they mattered. He has never hidden the fact that he wants more from his life. So he tells her the truth as he sees it. Yes, America mattered. Yes, opportunity mattered. Yes, his future mattered. But that does not mean Debby did not matter too. And suddenly the situation becomes far more complicated than Debby wanted. Because she was hoping for a clean answer. She wanted either innocence or betrayal. Instead, she gets something much messier. What if Mido did love her but also understood exactly what marrying her could do for his future? What if both things were true? People want manipulation to look simple. They want one person to be calculating and the other to be completely sincere. But relationships rarely break that neatly. Someone can care about you and still benefit from you. Someone can love you and still become selfish. Someone can enter a relationship for one reason and later become obsessed with another. And somebody can convince themselves their motives are pure, because admitting the full truth would destroy the image they have of themselves. Debby realizes she may never be able to prove what was inside Mido's head when he signed that certificate. So she stops trying. Instead, she decides to test the future. That is where Mido makes a mistake. He thinks surviving the conversation means the problem is fading. It is not. Debby has simply moved from asking questions to watching behavior. She stops automatically agreeing to Hollywood plans. She stops treating every new expense like an investment in their shared future. She begins separating love from financial support. When Mido brings up acting classes, she asks what he can contribute. When he talks about traveling, she asks how he plans to pay his share. When he mentions Los Angeles again, she tells him they are not moving anywhere until their marriage feels stable. Mido hates that answer. Because to him, stability and opportunity are not opposites. He believes they can build the marriage while he pursues the dream. Debby believes the dream is becoming the reason they cannot build the marriage at all. And then she discovers something that makes the situation even harder to dismiss. While looking through old messages and conversations, Debby notices that Mido was talking about an American entertainment future much earlier than she remembered. Not necessarily with some giant secret plan. Nothing that clean. That would almost be less disturbing. Instead, she sees fragments, comments about Los Angeles, questions about opportunities, ideas about meeting people. mentions of acting, small things that did not feel important at the time. Individually, none of them prove anything. Together, they create a pattern Debby cannot stop seeing. The Hollywood dream did not suddenly appear after America became real. It may have been sitting quietly in the background for much longer. And now Debby asks herself the question she has been avoiding. When Mido first imagined a life with her, how much of that picture was actually about her? That question hurts, because there is no document that can answer it. The marriage certificate can prove a date. It cannot prove a motive. A message can prove Mido wanted Hollywood. It cannot prove he did not love Debby. A fight can prove he was unhappy. It cannot prove why. And Debby starts to understand that the most painful betrayals are sometimes the ones you can never completely establish. You just feel the pattern changing underneath you. Mido notices Debby pulling away. He becomes frustrated that she is treating every dream he has like a confession. He tells her she is rewriting their relationship. And again, he may be partly right. Because once suspicion enters a relationship, the past becomes unstable. A romantic gesture can suddenly look strategic. A promise can sound rehearsed. An argument can look like hidden resentment. Even genuine affection can become suspicious because you start asking what happened immediately before and immediately afterward. Mido feels like nothing he does can survive Debby's new interpretation. If he is affectionate, she wonders what he wants. If he gets frustrated, she thinks the mask is slipping. If he talks about work, she hears Hollywood. If he avoids talking about work, she thinks he is hiding something. He finally tells her that she has already decided who he is. Debby answers that she is trying to decide who she married. That is the moment this stops being about the certificate. The certificate only opened the door. Now the real conflict is identity. Mido wants Debby to see him as a husband with ambition. Debby fears she may be a wife attached to an ambition. Mido believes he is being punished for wanting success. Debby believes she is being asked to finance a future that may eventually exclude her. Neither interpretation is easy to dismiss, so Debby creates one boundary that changes everything. She tells Mido she will support their marriage. She will not automatically fund Hollywood. If he wants acting classes, they will discuss the budget. If he wants new photographs, he needs a practical plan. If he wants to travel, he needs to contribute. If he wants Los Angeles, he needs to show her why moving would benefit their marriage and not only his career. And then she says the sentence Mido was not prepared to hear. I need to know you would still choose me if I could do nothing for your dream. Mido immediately says that is unfair. Debby asks him to answer anyway. He says he chose her already. She points toward the certificate. Then show me what that choice means now. That is the trap neither of them expected. Because the marriage certificate once looked like the strongest proof Mido could offer. Now Debby is saying the certificate proves almost nothing. A signature is easy. Staying when the dream becomes difficult is the evidence she actually wants. And suddenly Mido has a problem much bigger than Hollywood. If he remains with Debby and builds a life that looks nothing like the glamorous future he imagined, maybe viewers will realize they judged his ambition too harshly. Maybe he really did love her and simply reacted badly when reality disappointed him. Maybe the career obsession was insecurity, not strategy. Maybe Debby's suspicion almost destroys a marriage that was complicated but genuine. But if Mido becomes colder every time Debby closes her wallet, every time she refuses Los Angeles, every time she asks him to create a realistic plan, then a completely different picture begins forming. Not because Debby proves what he wanted in the beginning, because Mido reveals what he values when the benefits disappear. That is why the certificate becomes so important, not as proof of a scam, as the beginning of a test. Mido wanted commitment. Now he has it. But commitment comes with ordinary days, ordinary bills, ordinary frustrations, and a wife who is no longer willing to confuse support with surrender. Hollywood remains far away. The acting career is still uncertain. The glamorous future he imagined has not materialized overnight. And Debby is watching what happens when the fantasy stops carrying the relationship. Mido can keep chasing the dream. Nobody is stopping him. The question is whether he can chase it without turning Debby into the engine. For the first time, Debby understands that she does not need to expose every hidden motive. She does not need a confession. She does not need Mido to admit that America influenced him. She does not even need to know exactly what he believed when they married. She only needs to stop making the answer easy for him. Take away the automatic money. Take away the guaranteed move. Take away the assumption that Debby will rearrange her entire life around his ambitions. Then watch. That is where motives become harder to hide. Because if Mido's strongest connection is to Debby, the marriage can survive disappointment. If his strongest connection is to the future he thought Debby represented, disappointment will eventually turn into resentment. And Debby already sees flashes of that resentment. Not enough to prove anything, just enough to keep her awake. A comment here. A frustrated reaction there. A sudden change in mood when money enters the conversation. A level of excitement when Hollywood comes up that she rarely sees when they discuss their actual marriage. Maybe Debby is reading too much into it. Maybe she has become so afraid of being used that she is turning ordinary conflict into something much darker. That possibility terrifies her too. Because accusing someone you love of loving your opportunities more than you is not something you can easily take back. But neither is ignoring the feeling until your entire life has been reorganized around their dream. So Debby does the only thing left. She waits, not passively. Carefully, she watches what Mido does next. Does he find work? Does he make his own plan? Does he show patience? Does he invest in the marriage when there is nothing immediate to gain from it? Does he become more loving when Debby becomes more cautious? Or does affection disappear the moment access becomes difficult? Those answers will tell her more than the marriage certificate ever could. And Mido knows it. For the first time, the pressure has reversed. Before, Debby felt like she had to convince Mido that their life could be enough. Now Mido has to convince Debby that she was never simply the road to somewhere else. That is a much harder performance. Because Debby is no longer impressed by promises. She wants consistency. She wants sacrifice. She wants to see Mido choose something that does not move him closer to Hollywood, but does move him closer to her. And if he cannot do that, then the problem was never Louisiana. It was never the house. It was never the distance from Los Angeles. It was never the lack of glamour. The problem was that Debby believed marriage meant arriving, while Mido may have believed marriage meant finally getting started. Now both of those expectations are colliding. The certificate that once looked like their strongest bond suddenly looks like the line separating two completely different dreams. Debby wanted proof that Mido would stay. Mido wanted proof that his future was moving. They signed the same document. They may never have agreed on what it meant. And that leaves one question hanging over everything. What happens when Mido finally has to choose between the woman he married and the version of America he imagined before he ever arrived? Because Debby has already decided she will not make that choice for him. She will not finance the answer. She will not relocate just to avoid discovering it. She will not keep changing herself to make his disappointment disappear. Mido now has exactly what he supposedly wanted. The marriage. No fantasy attached. No guaranteed Hollywood launch. No unlimited support. Just Debby, real life, and the commitment written on that certificate. And if that is suddenly not enough for him, Debby may finally understand what that hidden piece of paper was really worth.